Let's give this little number some context. In the 1870s, the New Zealand government undertook large expenditure in order to upgrade the country's fledgling infrastructure, railways, roads, that sort of thing, all with borrowed money. At the time, the population of New Zealand was around 600,000, many of them new immigrants, part of an assisted migration scheme, newcomers that were finding their feet and chasing their fortunes in the goldfields. Dunedin was unsurprisingly the place to be. The country's economic fortunes turned tits up in the 1880s when the world's economy was plunged into what became known as the Long Depression for obvious reasons. The first whiff of the Depression coming our way started when the City of Glasgow Bank abruptly closed its doors on its 133 branches in 1878. To put this collapse in modern-day terms, it would be like the ASB ceasing business one day. The demise of the City of Glasgow Bank had a flow-on effect that came to our shores. New Zealand was, for better or worse, attached at the hip to Mother England. It wouldn't even be till 1934 New Zealand would set up a reserve bank. Even the darlings of the new outpost, the farmers, faced hard times as wool prices plummeted. Banks foreclosed and farmers were forced off the land. It wasn't till 1882 that New Zealand farmers would have a second string to their bows. That came in the form of the ability to export refrigerated meat. As things began to bite, more people were leaving than coming in, and some were going to Australia or the US. Most simply packed up and went back to the UK. Underpinning the faltering economy, a tiny one at that, was gold. The government offered a substantial finder's fee for anyone who could locate other valuable minerals in the form of diamonds or rubies, etc. Therefore, when reports came from Canterbury in late 1882 that diamonds had been discovered, they were greeted with wild enthusiasm by both the government and public alike. This first discovery sparked other claims in rapid succession. February 1883, 150 kilometres from downtown Auckland. Picton followed in May, and diamonds were popping up all over the joint. Meanwhile, tests from the original find near Methven didn't paint much of a picture of what was being called diamonds. Did this bridle enthusiasm? Hell no. By then, streets and sections were being pegged at Mount Somers, a pub established, and mining rights sold. When you think about diamonds and their origins, you will think about this. Probably not that. This also comes to mind. Never say this image. This perhaps. Unlikely here being Mount Somers, Canterbury, which for 10 months in 1883 became the planned site for Diamond Town, all 500 acres of it, all for it to fall over. After repeated tests verified the grim news, the shareholders were left to count their losses, and diamonds had lost their gloss. The Canterbury Diamond Rush of 1883 is down to one person, German immigrant Isaac Jacobson, a civil engineer and architect by trade. It was he that announced to a sceptical local press there were diamonds in them hills of Methven. 2 years earlier to this discovery, the dogmatic Jacobson had also trumpeted he'd located a huge gold reef near his home in Nelson, the prophetically named Hidden Treasure Mine. Ably assisted in those claims by a committee member of what was then the professional body for miners, the Industrial Association. His sidekick and biggest fanboy's name was Mr. T.O. Kelsey. Only that gold mine turned out just to be what it was called, hidden, not the first strike and miss. Geological claims weren't the only ones Jacobson had made during his life. He claimed to be the creator of the 8-hour working day in New Zealand, which he wasn't. As mentioned at the time, the Ministry of Mines offered a substantial finder's fee for anyone who could locate a payable diamond or ruby field. First impressions from their perspective weren't good. This tentative approach by the press and government had its origins in California a decade prior. There, two miners who had a marginal gold claim decided they would perpetrate what was then the US's biggest fraud. They pulled their money and went out and purchased some raw diamonds and rubies, rode into town with their fortune, and then pronounced they had dug it up on their property. They got diamond fever rolling and shareholders' money pouring in, only for the thing to collapse and the two miners to fly the coop. Bound to be a video on that somewhere on YouTube. On inspection, however, the government officials were less than impressed. New Zealand's own Kimberley looked dead in the water before the first sod had even been turned. None of this extinguished the fervour from Jacobson or Kelsey. They were confident what they had discovered were diamonds, and Diamond Town was where anyone could make their fortune in precious gems. Those on the ground would reap the most. Jacobson even indicated what he called the matrix or prime source locations. Plenty of people were willing to take the gamble. Mining companies popped up left, right and centre. The largest one being Pioneer Diamond Company, that had the prime spot because that was Jacobson's. All of this was playing out in the local newspapers. On your screen is a fellow and way better known German immigrant. That's Julian von Haast. He is known to Kiwis mostly as an explorer, the pass and the river bearing his name. What is less known is those explorations were of a geological nature. He knew the difference between quartz and diamonds at 20 paces. The samples he was given from Alford forests he pronounced were worthless, and he wanted the world to know. Least people threw their money down the gurgler. He did this under his formal title, Professor, via a blunt letter that appeared in all the majors. Read it whilst I twiddle my thumbs for 20 seconds. Also in the Stop This Madness camp was another German heavyweight in this field, another professor, this chap, George Ehrlich. He'd studied, lectured and got his hands dirty mining in Europe, South America and Australia before coming to New Zealand to set up a dedicated New Zealand School of Mines in Dunedin, which allowed him to scoot around Otago looking for goodies. Ehrlich landed what you would have thought was a killer blow upon the believers. So far, all Jacobson and Kelsey had to back up their claims was a lot of bluster and the word of an expat South African miner who had worked in the fields there. Jacobson also played the papers, rebuffed those who were about to poo-poo his claims. He was going to send Kelsey to London with the samples. He'd take the diamonds to the top jewellers there. Jacobson was going to prove Professors Picton, von Haast and Ehrlich wrong. A crowd of 20 supporters saw Kelsey off at Littleton Port. Meanwhile, as Kelsey sailed north, a diamond expert from South Africa called Mike Herman was heading south to check out what all the kerfuffle was about in New Zealand. If all the publicity was right, he'd get a foot in the door and pick up some bargain buys at the same time. Now in London, Kelsey touted the diamonds around the jewellers and telegrammed Jacobson with some fairly positive news. Well, at least it wasn't devastating news. A fair proportion were low-value diamonds, according to one shop. A vindicated Jacobson rushed off to the press. Needless to say, Kelsey's telegram led to a mass rush of blood to the head. That paper headline sums it up. New mining companies were set up left, right and centre. In just 1 week, 58 new prospecting licences were issued. Pioneer Diamond Company shares went through the roof, 15 quid to 50, At IPO, they went to the market at just 2. The plans for a giant mine shaft on the scale of those in South Africa were unveiled. Press, though, was still less than enthusiastic, continued to use the term supposed. Remember, those were the days when the country possessed an independent media. Newspapers like the Oamaru Mail could go to town, which they did. In this article, they poured scorn on the so-called diamonds 200 miles up the track, stating bluntly,
"The diamonds are nothing of the kind, but are absolutely worthless. To call them diamonds is rank deception. The fields are bogus. Our independent tests prove they are rock crystal."
Into this conundrum stepped the South African diamond expert Mark Herman. Since arriving in the country, he'd been besieged by miners wanting to sell their diamonds. Here's what he had to say. Yep, the blows kept coming. And days later, Kelsey was telegramming from London with a different story. And to paraphrase, as things were falling apart, the stubborn Jacobson called in another expert of his choosing, an ex-Kimberley miner called Harris, who, upon spending a week at the site, opined rather open-endedly the crystals bore the same relationship to diamonds, and the way convincing not. The soil was just right, and they should be there. At this very moment, the share certificates in diamond companies were becoming the 19th century versions of equity court and judge. The public began railing against those who had promoted the diamond fields, sold a lie. The average man and woman on the street had turned septic. By December, those who had been spruiked into investing into a worthless mine either licked their wounds at their petulant greed getting the better of them, or sued the promoters, as in the case you can see in front of you. Amazingly, in the face of all this opposition, with Pioneer shares now worth just pennies, Jacobson rallied what was left of his shareholders to support investing into a giant open mine shaft, and proclaimed the valuable diamonds would be located deep below the surface, and he'd sent further samples off to London for testing. But by now, no one believed him. Such was the vitriol, he could no longer walk the streets of Christchurch without facing abuse or threats of violence. Feigning, "The weather in Canterbury is not agreeable to my health," the 61-year-old left town, headed back to Nelson. He died there at the age of 84. One of the houses he built is now on the Historic Places Trust list, for its architectural significance, I must add. As I close this one out, you'll remember I talked about the claims of diamonds near Auckland and the massive Californian fraud. Well, the so-called Auckland find was a less sophisticated replica of the US. Similar. Pronounce you've got millions in precious gems sitting tantalisingly just below the surface of a marginal farm that just happens to be currently up for sale. Only there are no real diamonds. And for good measure, whilst all these shenanigans were going on, there was yet another diamond find I have to mention, this time near Queenstown, a spitting distance of the steamer wharf. So next time you're down there, ask the motel owner for a spade, then start digging up his front lawn. Bye for now.